The worn, faded uniform didn't fit the modern world of the bustling shopping mall. To the quick-glancing eyes of a few impatient strangers, the elderly man was an oddity, a relic blocking the aisle. Their muttered jokes and pointed laughter were cheap, easy currency. They didn't see the fabric heavy with silence, the stripes that were maps of forgotten battles, or the story in the slight stoop of his shoulders. They were about to learn that some debts of honor are never closed, and that mocking a ghost can summon an entire regiment. The air in the Maple Oaks Mall was a warm, bland mix of pretzel salt and perfume. Frank Burgess moved through it slowly, a solitary, steady ship in a sea of frantic currents. At 82, his joints spoke their own creaking language, each step a measured negotiation. He wore his old Marine Corps dress blues. The jacket was tied across his shoulders now, the wool thin at the elbows, the gold of the buttons dulled by time and careful polishing. On his left chest, a small array of ribbons told a quiet, complicated story for anyone who knew how to read it. A Purple Heart was among them. He wore the uniform every year on this date, November 14th, a private ritual before visiting the cemetery. It was a promise, a way to feel the weight of the brotherhood again, to feel close to the men who hadn't come home. His destination was a small bench near the central fountain, a place to gather his thoughts. But the mall was crowded, and his pace was a boulder in the stream. A group of 3 young men, maybe in their early 20s, dressed in expensive athletic wear, came up fast behind him. One, a blond guy with a loud laugh named Chad, bumped into Frank's shoulder. "Whoa, watch the vintage costume, Pops," he snickered, stepping back. Halloween was last month. His friends, Tyler and Mike, chuckled. Frank paused, turning slightly. He offered a small, patient nod. "My apologies," he said, his voice a soft rasp. But, as he tried to move on, the group circled around, not with malice, but with a careless cruelty born of boredom. "Seriously, though," Tyler said, eyeing the uniform. "Where'd you get that? A museum? Or like a party store?" Mike pulled out his phone, aiming it. "Gotta get this. Grandpa's last stand at the food court." Frank's face, a landscape of fine lines and weathered skin, tightened. A deep ache, older than his bones, flared. It wasn't the pain of the words themselves, but the sheer, empty distance they traveled from. They saw a costume. They didn't see the chosen reservoir, where the cold bit deeper than any insult. They didn't see the young man he was, shivering in a foxhole, that same uniform crusted with ice. "This is the uniform of the United States Marines," Frank said, the words firmer now. Chad laughed louder, performing for the phone. "Hoorah or whatever. Did you actually fight? Or just polish shoes?" A few other shoppers glanced over, some frowning, others smiling uncertainly at the loud boys. Frank felt a hot flush crawl up his neck. He saw not these boys, but other young faces, the sneering ones from a different time, long ago, when he'd first come home to a country that didn't understand. He'd faced worse than words. He straightened his back as much as he could, the movement causing a twinge in his knee, a souvenir from a long fall on a rocky hillside. He decided to ignore them, aiming for his bench. But his path took him past the open food court. As he walked, the boy with the phone, Mike, followed alongside, narrating. "And here we have the last living member of the what war was it again? The War of the Roses." Their laughter echoed off the tile. A young mother with a stroller saw it happening. Her name was Sarah. She felt a spike of anger. "Leave him alone," she said, but her voice was lost in the mall's noise. An older couple shook their heads, but walked faster, not wanting involvement. The mockery created a bubble of uncomfortable spectacle. Frank finally reached his bench and sat, placing his hands on his knees, staring at the dancing water of the fountain. He was trying to find the calm place inside, the one he'd built over decades. The boys, seeing their entertainment sitting down, seemed to lose interest. "Whatever, let's go," Chad said, and they swaggered off, still laughing, already forgetting. But someone had not just watched. A man in his 40s, named David, had been sitting at a coffee kiosk. He had a sharp, observant look. He hadn't just seen the mockery. He'd studied Frank's uniform, his posture, the specific set of his jaw. David had served a decade in the army. He recognized the ribbons. He knew the cut of the old uniform. And, more importantly, he knew what that particular date on the mall's calendar might mean to a man of Frank's age. He didn't confront the boys. Instead, he took out his own phone, made a quiet call, then pulled up a contact he hadn't messaged in years, a friend who was now a gunnery sergeant at the local Marine Corps Reserve Center. Frank sat on the bench, the the cold from the marble seeping through his trousers. The fountain's burble was supposed to be soothing, but now it just sounded like chaotic noise. He closed his eyes, not to rest, but to escape. The present mall faded. The music, the scent of cinnamon, the blur of shoppers. In its place came the past, sharp and clear and brutal. He was no longer Frank Burgess, elderly man. He was Burgee, an 18-year-old private, freezing in the Korean winter of 1950. The memory wasn't a story he told. It was a place he was pulled into. He felt the canvas of his pack straps biting into his shoulders, the cruel, dry cold that made every breath a knife. He saw the faces of his fire team, Rodriguez, with his constant, nervous jokes, Jenkins, who could fix anything, and O'Malley, their big, red-haired corporal, who had a wife and a baby photo tucked in his helmet liner. They were moving along a frozen ridge, the famous Frozen Chosen. Their uniforms, like the one he wore now, were not made for that hellish cold. The order came down, hold the hill. It wasn't even a name on a map, just a bump in a white nightmare. They dug in, the ground like iron. The Chinese attack came at night, a tide of shadows and whistles and flashes. The world exploded into noise and terror. Frank remembered the deafening bang of his own rifle, the acrid smell of cordite, the tracers painting red lines through the dark. Then, the searing hot punch in his side. He went down, the wind knocked out of him. O'Malley was there instantly, dragging him back into the shallow foxhole, ripping open a field dressing. "You're okay, Burgee. Look at me. Just a scratch." But O'Malley's own face was tight with pain. In the chaotic retreat that followed, with orders to fight their way back to the sea, they were carrying their wounded. Frank, woozy from pain and blood loss, was half-dragged, half-carried by Jenkins and Rodriguez. O'Malley covered their retreat, his rifle cracking in the darkness. The last Frank saw of him, O'Malley was a silhouette against a snowburst, standing tall. He never made it off that hill. Frank's eyes snapped open. He was back on the bench, sweat cooling on his temples despite the mall's warmth. His hand instinctively went to his side, where the scar, thick and ropey, lay beneath the wool. The boy's words, costume, party store, echoed in a new, horrifying context. They had mocked not just him, but O'Malley's sacrifice, Rodriguez's frozen tears, Jenkins's desperate strength. They had reduced that sacred, painful memory to a joke. A profound loneliness, deeper than any he'd felt in years, settled over him. He felt untethered from the world around him. These people shopping for sneakers and smoothies lived in a different universe, one built on the peace bought by boys in uniforms like this, and they had no idea. Meanwhile, David's call had set something in motion. His friend, Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Johnson, heard the description, an elderly man in vintage dress blues, with a specific ribbon stack including a Korean War service medal and a Purple Heart, being publicly ridiculed on November 14th. Johnson didn't need a name. The date and the uniform were enough. He knew the history. November 14th was when the Chosen Reservoir campaign had begun in earnest for many units. He walked out of his office into the main bay of the Reserve Center, where a dozen Marines and utilities were cleaning gear. "Listen up," his voice, used to cutting through engine noise, silenced the room. He explained the situation, not as an order, but as a matter of honor. "There's a brother out there who just got reminded that some people forgot. Let's go remind them who he is." No one hesitated. Within 20 minutes, 6 Marines, including Johnson, were in their own immaculate dress blues, their medals gleaming, their faces set in serious lines. They piled into 2 cars, a quiet, determined convoy heading for the Maple Oaks Mall. Frank decided to leave. The ritual felt broken, the connection to his comrades sullied. He pushed himself up from the bench, the simple act requiring effort. He would skip the quiet lunch he'd planned and go straight to the cemetery. Maybe there, among the silent white stones, he could find the dignity that had been stolen from him in the crowded, noisy mall. His route to the main doors took him back past the central concourse. Fate, or perhaps the simple layout of the building, brought him within sight of the same group of boys. They were now lounging near a sunglasses kiosk, sipping large sodas. Chad spotted Frank first. A fresh, stupid grin spread across his face. "Hey, look, he's still here. Marching orders finally. Come in, sir." The others turned. Emboldened by their earlier lack of consequences and the presence of a wider audience, the mockery resumed, slightly louder. "Think he's looking for his time machine?" Mike said, raising his phone again. This time, a few other teenagers, drawn to the drama, lingered nearby, smiling. Frank stopped. He felt a surge not of anger, but of a deep, weary resolve. He wouldn't run from this. He turned to face them fully. His voice, when it came, was low but carried the gravel of command he hadn't used in 50 years. You boys think this is funny. It wasn't a question. Chad, thrown by the directness, shrugged. It's just weird, man. Why are you wearing that? Frank took a step closer, his blue eyes locking onto Chad's. I wear it for men who didn't get the chance to grow old enough to be mocked by children. He gestured to his ribbons. This blue and white one. That's the presidential unit citation. Every man in my unit got it. We earned it by being surrounded, outnumbered 10-1, in temperatures 40 below zero. This red one with the white stripes? The Purple Heart. That's for a piece of shrapnel that's still in me. I wear it so I don't forget the man who saved my life that night. A man named O'Malley who stayed behind to cover our retreat. He's still over there in the frozen ground of Korea. The food court had grown quieter. Frank's words, spoken with raw, unvarnished truth, cut through the ambient noise. The smirks on the boys' faces were fading, replaced by a dawning, uncomfortable awareness. They weren't teasing a quirky old man anymore. They were staring into the eyes of history, and it was accusing them. Just then, the main entrance doors, 50 feet away, slid open. A collective shift in the light and energy of the space made everyone turn. 6 United States Marines in full dress uniforms stood framed in the doorway. Their shoes were mirrors. Their brass gleamed like fire. Their uniforms were sharp enough to cut the air. They moved not as individuals, but as a single, synchronized unit, their steps a quiet, authoritative rhythm on the tile floor. Every eye in the concourse was drawn to them. The contrast was staggering. The careless, colorful chaos of the mall against the disciplined, solemn blue and red. The Marines didn't scan the crowd. They had one focal point. Led by Gunnery Sergeant Johnson, they walked with direct purpose straight toward Frank Burgess. The crowd parted before them like a sea. Chatter died. Phone cameras came up, but not to mock, to record something extraordinary. The boys who had mocked Frank froze, their blood turning to ice. Chad's soda felt heavy and childish in his hand. They watched, mouths slightly agape, as the squad of Marines came to a halt a perfect 3 paces in front of the old veteran. Absolute silence gripped the mall's central atrium. The only sounds were the distant ding of a register and the ever-present splash of the fountain. Gunnery Sergeant Johnson took one more precise step forward. He looked at Frank, taking in the old uniform, the proud, pained bearing, the ribbons that matched the history he knew. Then, in a movement that was both powerful and profoundly respectful, he snapped a razor-sharp salute, his hand held in perfect position. Behind him, the other 5 Marines followed in unison. 6 salutes, held in the still air of a shopping mall, directed at one elderly man. It was a tableau of immense power and tradition. Frank Burgess, for a heartbeat, was stunned. The sight of the uniforms, so crisp and familiar, yet worn by faces young enough to be his grandsons, was overwhelming. Then, decades of ingrained discipline and emotion took over. Slowly, painfully, but with unmistakable dignity, he straightened his spine to its fullest height. He brought his own trembling hand up to his brow, returning the salute with every ounce of honor he possessed. His eyes, suddenly, bright with unshed tears, remained locked with Johnson's. The salute held for a long, respectful moment. Time seemed to stop. For Frank, the mall vanished. He was on a parade ground. He was with his brothers. He was connected once more to the unbroken chain of service. The shame and loneliness evaporated, burned away by this fierce, public affirmation. Johnson dropped his salute. Frank lowered his hand. Then, the gunny did something not in any manual. He stepped forward and extended his hand. Frank took it, a strong, warm grip connecting 2 generations of warriors. "Sir," Johnson said, his voice loud enough for the hushed crowd to hear. "On behalf of the Commandant of the Marine Corps and all Marines past and present, we are honored to stand with you. We heard a fellow Marine needed reminding of who he is. We are here." One of the other Marines, a young corporal, stepped forward. In his hands was a small, folded bundle of cloth. He unfolded it. It was a modern Marine Corps dress blue cover, or hat. "Sir," the young corporal said, his voice thick with emotion, "your cover, from your era, is part of your history. But we'd be proud if you'd wear one of ours today." With gentle hands, they helped Frank remove his old, weathered cover and place the new, sharp one on his head. It was a simple, devastatingly symbolic act of renewal and inclusion. A soft sob was heard from the crowd. The young mother, Sarah, had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The older couple who had walked away earlier were now holding each other's hands, their faces solemn. Then the Marines turned. As one, their gaze settled on the three young men, now pale and looking desperately small. Johnson didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was calm, cold steel. You three, front and center. Now, Chad, Tyler, and Mike moved as if their feet were made of lead. They shuffled forward, unable to meet the eyes of the Marines or the now transformed figure of Frank. The crowd watched, a silent jury. Gunnery Sergeant Johnson didn't berate them. Instead, he turned slightly, making it clear he was addressing both them and the wider audience. You see this uniform? He began, his hand indicating Frank, then himself. It's not fabric. It's a story. In this story, men your age fought in trenches, on beaches, in jungles, and in frozen mountains so you could stand in a mall on a safe afternoon and make stupid choices. You mocked a living piece of that history. You dishonored more than this man. You dishonored the idea of sacrifice itself. He gestured to the new cover on Frank's head. You see this? This means he's one of us. Always has been, always will be. And when you disrespect one Marine, you disrespect all of us. You disrespect every single name on the wall, every stone in Arlington, every flag on a grave. The silence was total. Johnson then looked back at the boys. You owe this man an apology. Not to us. To him. And it better mean something. Chad was the first to break. All his bravado was gone, replaced by a crushing, shameful understanding. He looked at Frank, really looked, and saw the hero he'd been blind to before. His voice cracked. Sir, I am so sorry. We were idiots. We didn't know. Tyler and Mike mumbled their own ashamed apologies, their eyes on the floor. Frank looked at them, these scared, foolish boys. The heat of his anger had cooled, replaced by something else, pity and a faint hope. He nodded slowly. Apology accepted, he said, his voice hoarse. Then, he added, knowing better is what comes next. Johnson gave a final, curt nod to the boys, a dismissal. They slunk away, the lesson etched into them forever. The gunny then turned back to Frank. Sir, with your permission, we'd like to escort you, wherever you're headed. Frank thought of the cemetery of O'Malley. I have a visit to make, he said. Then, we'll take you, Johnson said. They formed up around him, not as a guard, but as an honor guard. 2 Marines fell in beside him, the others ahead and behind. As they began their slow, proud march through the mall toward the doors, something remarkable happened. The shoppers, who had been spectators, became participants. First, Sarah, the young mother, began to clap. Then, the older couple joined. Then, a store clerk. Then, a group of teenagers. It wasn't raucous applause, but a steady, respectful, growing wave of sound. People put their hands over their hearts. An elderly man in a veteran's cap from a different war stood stiffly at attention and saluted as Frank passed. Frank walked among the Marines, his head held high, the new cover firm on his brow. He felt the love and respect pouring from the crowd, a balm on the earlier hurt. He wasn't a mocked relic anymore. He was an honored symbol, a bridge between the past's sacrifice and the present's peace. They emerged into the afternoon sun. Frank wasn't driven to the cemetery in a quiet sedan. The Marines had arranged for something more fitting. As they stood at the curb, a local police cruiser, its lights silently flashing in respect, pulled up to lead the way. Behind it were the Marines' cars, with Frank in the place of honor in the lead vehicle. It was a small, impromptu procession. At the cemetery, the Marines walked with Frank to a simple, white military headstone that read Corporal Sean O'Malley, U.S. Marine Corps, Korea. Frank stood before it for a long time. The Marine stood back, giving him his moment. Finally, Frank slowly removed his new cover. He placed it carefully on the top of the headstone. Kept my promise, Sean, he whispered. They remember. He stood back, and Gunnery Sergeant Johnson gave a quiet order. The 6 Marines lined up facing O'Malley's grave. In the quiet of the sacred field, their voices rang out clear and strong as they offered a final 3-volley rifle salute, with blanks that cracked the sky, followed by the haunting, pure notes of taps played by one of the Marines on a bugle he had brought. Frank Burgess listened, the tears finally flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. They were not tears of sadness, but of release, of honor restored, of a bond reaffirmed across the decades. He had come to the mall feeling like a ghost, and he was leaving it, and this field, knowing he was forever a Marine. The uniform, old or new, was just the skin. The brotherhood was the soul, and it had just shown up, in full dress, to prove it was eternal.